The wind over Iberia never rests. It howls across the scorched plains of La Mancha, whispers through the pine-cloaked hills of Asturias, and rolls down the stone alleys of Toledo like the breath of something ancient. It remembers. Even when kingdoms fall and thrones are forgotten, the land remembers. But before this was Spain, before the bullfights, the conquistadors, or the whispers of corruption echoing through marble corridors, this land was a battleground, not just of swords and shields, but of identities, religions, and dynasties clawing for permanence in a world that offered none. And when Rome fell, the silence was terrifying. The year is 476. The Western Roman Empire, the colossus that had ruled the known world, collapses under the weight of its own decay. Across Europe, provinces once drenched in Roman law and Latin ritual now splinter into tribal fiefdoms, where warlords masquerade as kings. In the Iberian Peninsula, the chaos is immediate and violent. The streets of cities once ordered by Roman discipline now echo with a different cadence. Barbaric tongues, the clatter of hoofbeats, and the uncertain rhythm of a new dark age. And from the north, a shadow moves. Not native, not invited, but inevitable. The Visigoths. They had once stood at the gates of Rome itself, torching the Eternal City in 410. But that moment of glory was brief. They were wanderers, Germanic, hardened, restless, pushed westward by pressures from the Huns, from other tribes, from the exhaustion of never truly belonging. For decades, they wandered the European continent like a storm with no destination. Until now. They find their purpose in the fractured corpse of Roman Hispania. Southern France and northern Spain become the bones on which they build their kingdom. Their leader, Euric, sharp, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless, seizes what remains of Roman order and reshapes it, not into something new, into something theirs. Under his command, the Visigoths carve out the first true kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. Toledo, once a modest Roman outpost, becomes the nerve center of an emerging monarchy. Its narrow streets and fortified walls soon echo not with Latin decrees, but with the guttural cadence of Gothic ambition. This is not the Spain of postcards and palaces. This is a kingdom of blood and suspicion, of shifting loyalties and assassinations in candlelit corridors. Do you feel that? That tension in your chest? That's the weight of a monarchy being born not in triumph, but in fire. The Visigothic kings rule with iron hands and calloused hearts. There is no divine right here, only the right to survive. Each crown is earned through betrayal, warfare, or sheer luck. To be king is to be a target, and to rule is to balance on the edge of a blade. They were Christian, but not as Rome understood it. The early Visigothic kings followed Arianism, a belief that denied the full divinity of Christ. To the Catholic majority in Hispania, they were heretics, foreign kings pushing a foreign faith, and yet they demanded obedience. The result? A kingdom constantly at war with itself. Internally, Visigothic nobles plotted ceaselessly. Bloodlines meant little. Power was what mattered, and it changed hands often. There were kings who reigned for decades, and others who reigned for days. Poison was a common language in court. Dagger wounds a frequent punctuation in the lives of royals. Externally, pressure mounted from the Franks in the north, Berber tribes from the south, and Byzantine incursions from the east. And always, always, the people watched, torn between loyalty and fear. But perhaps the most pivotal turn came not through war, but through faith. In 589, King Record I did something that shattered centuries of Gothic tradition. He converted to Catholicism, a move so bold it nearly cost him his throne. But he wasn't chasing piety. He was chasing control. By adopting the faith of the majority, Record hoped to unify his fractured kingdom, not under the sword, but under the cross. And it worked. For a time. The conversion of the Visigothic elite to Catholicism reshaped Iberia. It opened new lines of communication between nobles and clergy, between court and countryside. For once, the crown and the altar spoke in the same tongue. Laws were codified, councils were held, the kingdom had order, However fragile, but order never lasts. The strength of the Visigothic monarchy would prove to be its greatest weakness. It created a court bloated with intrigue, a clergy drunk on power, and a nobility eager to manipulate both. Kings could be crowned in one season and buried in the next, and in the shadows, a darker tide began to rise, one that would change the peninsula forever. For now, the Visigoths stood as masters of Iberia, but history is never satisfied. It demands more. And in 711, its hunger would be fed by the crossing of a narrow strait and the arrival of a new force, one not born in Europe, but in the deserts of Arabia. But before the crescent moon rose over Hispania, before the mosques and minarets, before the Reconquista and the crowns of Castile, we must linger a moment longer in Toledo. Imagine it, a city on edge. The cathedral bells echo over slate roofs. Beneath them, whispers of treason circulate like disease. The king paces in his hall, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, never trusting, never still. Somewhere in the darkness, a knife is being sharpened. Somewhere a prayer is whispered. And outside the city walls, a storm gathers. This is not a tale of glory. It is a tale of survival, of rulers who built thrones from the bones of empires, and of a nation still haunted by their legacy. Do you hear it? That wind again. It's calling us forward, through blood, through betrayal, through centuries of shadows, and we are only just beginning. The storm came not with thunder, but with silence. It began with whispers, barely spoken words carried on desert winds, reaching across the Strait of Gibraltar like a prophecy. In the courts of North Africa, the Umayyad Caliphate stirred. Not content with empires eastward, their eyes turned west, to Al-Andalus, the land of the Visigoths, a kingdom fractured, a throne weakening, a perfect invitation. But the seeds of conquest were not planted by caliphs or generals alone. They were sown from within. His name was Roderick, the last Visigothic king, crowned not by divine providence but by desperation. His ascent was riddled with scandal. Many believed he seized the throne unlawfully after the death of King Witiza, whose family still seethed in exile. Roderick's rule was not welcomed. It was endured. Nobles plotted. Bishops grew cold. Unity, once fragile, now crumbled. And from the edges of the kingdom, a betrayal. Count Julian, a powerful Visigothic noble in North Africa, humiliated perhaps by Roderick himself or driven by revenge over an unspeakable wrong, reached across enemy lines. He offered aid to the Muslims, ships, soldiers, a beachhead, and with that, the gates of Iberia creaked open. In the spring of 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad landed near Gibraltar with just 7,000 men. No fanfare, no royal heralds, just steel and resolve. He burned his ships upon arrival, not as a gesture of poetry, but of purpose. There would be no retreat. Have you ever watched a kingdom fall in real time? The Visigothic court certainly hadn't. They dismissed Tariq's arrival as a minor raid, another barbarian incursion to be swatted aside. But what they failed to see, what they refused to see, was that this was not a raid. It was the beginning of the end. Roderick, consumed by internal rebellion, was late to react, but when he did, he moved with force. He raised an army, some say 25,000 strong, and marched south to meet the invader. The clash came in the searing heat of July, near the banks of the Guadalete River. There, in the dust and blood, Visigothic rule met its reckoning. The battle was chaos. Historians disagree on the numbers, the tactics, even the outcome, but all agree on one thing. Roderick was defeated. Some say he died in battle, crushed beneath his horse. Others claim he fled, never to be seen again. His body was never found. His crown vanished. The Visigothic army disintegrated, and with them, centuries of rule vanished like breath on glass. From that moment on, Iberia ceased to be a Gothic land. Tariq pressed forward, his forces swelling as more Berber and Arab troops arrived. Cities fell with terrifying speed. Córdoba, Granada, Toledo. Each conquest not just a military triumph, but a psychological rupture. The idea of Gothic invincibility was shattered. and in its place rose a new identity, Al-Andalus. The Muslim conquest of Iberia was not just swift, it was transformative. Within a few years, nearly the entire peninsula came under Islamic rule. Only the rugged northern mountains held out, Asturias, Galicia, Cantabria, refuges for those who would one day ignite the Reconquista. But for now, those places were mere embers. In the cities, change came fast. Mosques rose where churches once stood. Arabic and Berber languages replaced Latin in the markets. Islamic law, the Sharia, governed where Gothic codes once reigned. But this was no simple conquest of extermination. It was absorption. Many Christians, Mozarabs, as they became known, remained, keeping their faith under Islamic rule. Jews, long persecuted by Visigothic kings, found new freedoms under the caliphate. It was not peace, but it was order, and under this new rule, Iberia blossomed. Have you ever walked through Córdoba in the golden hour? Have you seen the sunlight dance on the arches of the Mezquita, or felt the cool air in the shadowed courtyards of Granada? That legacy of architecture, poetry, science, and tolerance was born in the crucible of conquest. But not everyone saw it that way. To the scattered Christian nobility hiding in the mountains, this was not transformation. It was desecration. The fall of Visigothic Spain became a myth, retold not as a military failure, but a divine punishment, a cautionary tale. Roderick became a ghost king, a tragic figure whose sins had doomed a nation. And from that myth, resistance would be born. In the northern kingdom of Asturias, under the leadership of a man named Pelayo, rumored to be a noble, maybe even a relative of the last king, a rebellion stirred, small at first, insignificant, a spark in a storm. But Pelayo's defiance at the Battle of Covadonga in 722 became the first recorded Christian victory against Muslim forces in Iberia. It was symbolic more than strategic. Yet in symbols, nations are reborn. The Reconquista had begun, but it would not be swift. It would not be clean. It would take over 700 years. A slow, grinding, bitter war defined not only by battles and sieges, but by diplomacy, intermarriage, betrayal, and compromise. This was not the story of good versus evil. It was the story of memory, of identity, of people who refused to forget. But look closer. Not all Christians welcomed the fight, not all Muslims ruled with cruelty, and not all Jews chose sides. The truth of medieval Iberia is not found in the clash of empires, but in the spaces in between, in the merchants of Seville who spoke 3 languages, in the scholars of Toledo translating Aristotle from Arabic to Latin, in the poets of Zaragoza who praised both Allah and love in the same verse. For a time, Spain was not one kingdom. It was many. A mosaic of cultures, clashing and coexisting under 1,000 banners. But deep beneath it all, the idea of monarchy never died. It just waited, patiently, in the hills, in the churches, in the bloodlines of exiled nobles whispering old names and older oaths. The Visigoths were gone, but their dream, a Christian kingdom, unified, eternal, still lingered, and it would find new champions. A marriage, a sword, a crown. But that is still to come. For now, listen. Do you hear the silence that follows a fallen king? That stillness after the final cry of battle? That's the sound of history being rewritten. Not in ink, but in fire. Night settles differently in the northern mountains. It doesn't fall. It descends thick and absolute, cloaking the valleys of Asturias in a quiet that feels sacred. The cold here bites. The winds carry voices, and deep within the granite hollows a fire is kindling, not of hearth or home, but of resistance, of return. The year is 722. The Visigoths are dust. Their kingdom lies buried beneath new laws, new gods, and a rising golden civilization. In the south, Córdoba thrives under the Umayyads, its streets alive with call to prayer, its libraries bursting with knowledge imported from Damascus and Baghdad. The palaces of Al-Andalus glitter like dreams. But in the high country, the world is smaller, harder. Here, amid mist and mountain, the name of Christ is still whispered with desperation. The collapse of Gothic rule did not erase faith. It scattered it, into caves, into forests, into the blood of men too proud to bow. And from this wilderness, a figure emerges, Pelayo. We know almost nothing about him. Was he a Gothic noble? A disgraced soldier? A myth? The chronicles written centuries later claim he was the son of a duke, maybe even kin to King Roderick. But perhaps that's wishful thinking, an effort to draw a clean line between the ruin of the past and the hope of the future. What we do know is this: he refused to kneel. In a narrow pass carved into the Picos de Europa, a dark, foreboding place now known as Covadonga, Pelayo and a band of rebels made their stand. Fewer than 300 men, it is said, against a Muslim force many times their size. It was not a battle won by strength. It was won by terrain, by fury, by the belief that even in defeat, some things must be defended. The Muslim commander, seeing no strategic value in the remote, stubborn peaks of Asturias, withdrew. But in doing so, he left behind something far more dangerous than territory. He left behind a story. Pelayo's defiance became legend. His victory, modest though it was, transformed into prophecy. The first crack in an empire, the first blow of a reconquest that would take centuries to fulfill. And so a kingdom was born, not of marble and gold, but of stone and silence. The kingdom of Asturias, tiny, isolated, but alive. Here the old Gothic traditions flickered back to life, reshaped by the harshness of exile. Kings were no longer distant figures crowned in marble halls. They were warriors, leading charges, sharpening blades, praying in the dark. Their thrones were carved from mountain rock, their armies small but relentless. The line of Pelayo continued. His son Favila reigned briefly, only to be killed by a bear, a cruel, almost mythic fate. But with Alfonso the Fur, the Asturian crown found its teeth. A marriage into the old Visigothic nobility gave him legitimacy, and with it, ambition. Under Alfonso, Christian forces surged outward, not in conquest but in raids, swooping down from the hills to strike Muslim cities, burning, plundering, then vanishing back into the mists. It was not war, it was memory, a reminder to the caliphate that the north had not forgotten. But the Umayyads were not easily threatened. In 756, a fugitive prince from Damascus, Abd al-Rahman I, fled the chaos of civil war in the east and arrived in Iberia. Within a year, he had consolidated power in Córdoba and declared himself emir, independent, defiant. His dynasty would last nearly 3 centuries. He was brilliant, calculating, and he brought order to a land thirsty for it. Under the Umayyads, Al-Andalus became one of the most advanced societies in medieval Europe. Streets were paved, irrigation transformed fields into gardens. Philosophy and medicine flourished. The city of Córdoba rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople in grandeur. By the 10th century, it would become the largest city in Europe, with over 500,000 people, 70 libraries, and lights that burned long after sunset. But for all its brilliance, it was not invincible. Because in the north, something was stirring, not just in Asturias, but beyond. Christian resistance was no longer a whisper. It was becoming a chorus. New kingdoms emerged: Leon, Galicia, Navarre. Some were born of Asturias, others rose independently, and in the east, the rugged lands of Aragon began to assert themselves. Fragmented, yes, constantly at odds with one another, but united by a single idea: Reconquista, the taking back. Do you feel the shift? It wasn't sudden. It was slow, grinding, like the movement of tectonic plates. The Christians were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to expand, to return. And with each generation, their myth grew stronger. The Visigothic legacy was no longer a memory. It was a mandate. But war is never linear. Just as Christian kingdoms rose, they often fractured, torn by rivalries, succession crises, and betrayals. And Muslim rule in the south was far from stable. After the death of Abd al-Rahman III, the most powerful Umayyad Caliph of Al-Andalus, the empire began to fracture. By the early 11th century, civil war broke it apart into smaller kingdoms known as taifas. These taifa kingdoms were rich, cultured, but vulnerable. and the Christians knew it. What followed was a brutal century of shifting alliances, opportunistic sieges, and political chess. Christian kings married Muslim princesses. Muslim emirs paid Christian rulers for protection. Betrayal was not the exception, it was the strategy. The borderlands, known as the Marches, became zones of chaos. Fortresses rose like teeth across the hills. Farmers became soldiers. Priests became scribes of war. But amid this, one city stood apart. Toledo, ancient, sacred, once the Visigothic capital, now a jewel in the heart of Al-Andalus. For centuries it had stood untouched, its status as a cultural and religious melting pot giving it a unique identity. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side. Its libraries housed texts in Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and in 1085, it fell. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile took the city in a stunning campaign. He did not burn it. He claimed it, declared it a Christian city, but left its scholars, its texts, its soul intact. It became a bridge between worlds, a place where Christian Europe first rediscovered the lost knowledge of antiquity through Muslim translation and Jewish preservation. Toledo was not just a military victory, it was a cultural triumph. The Reconquista had crossed a threshold. No longer a flicker in the mountains, it now had a heart, a capital, and a king with the ambition to change history. But ambition breeds enemies, and far to the south, a new force was coming. One fiercer than the Umayyads, more fanatical than the Taifas, a storm rolling in from the sands of North Africa, the Almoravids, and they would not come as diplomats. They would come to purify, to burn, to make the Christian kings remember that Al-Andalus was not yet theirs, not yet. History, as ever, held its breath. The sands of the Sahara do not forget. They give nothing, take everything, and breed men who learn to do the same. Warriors shaped not by luxury or decadence, but by prayer, fire, and the unyielding sun. In the 11th century, as the Christian kingdoms of the north tasted triumph and grew bolder in their reclamation of Iberia, the south turned its eyes not inward, but across the sea. And what it saw there was a flame, the Almoravids. Born among the Berber tribes of present-day Mauritania and southern Morocco, the Almoravids were not kings, they were zealots. Followers of a strict interpretation of Islam that viewed the fractured, indulgent Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus as weak and impure. Their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, was no mere emir. He was a man with the bearing of a prophet and the ruthlessness of a conqueror. When the call came from Muslim rulers in Iberia, desperate and cornered by Christian advances, Yusuf did not hesitate. He crossed the sea. The year was 1086. The Christian king Alfonso VI, basking in his victory at Toledo, pressed further south, threatening the very heart of Muslim Iberia. The Taifa rulers, divided and disorganized, were powerless alone. But together, they pleaded for salvation from across the Strait of Gibraltar. Yusuf answered with fire. He landed with an army that was lean, brutal, and disciplined beyond anything the Taifas had known. On October 23rd, at the Battle of Sagrajas, Yusuf's forces met Alfonso's army near Badajoz. It wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. Alfonso's men were slaughtered, cut down with terrifying efficiency. Christian knights, used to fighting squabbling Taifas, were overwhelmed by the Almoravid tactics. Arrows fell like black rain. Cavalry smashed through lines like thunder. Survivors fled north, bloodied and silent. The message was clear. The south would not fall quietly. But Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not simply come to save Al-Andalus. He came to take it. The Taifa rulers, who had invited him in, quickly realized their mistake. One by one, Yusuf deposed them. Cities were absorbed into his growing empire. Granada, Seville, Badajoz, all fell under the banner of a new puritanical order. The Almoravids imposed strict religious law, outlawing luxuries, censoring art, and demanding obedience to their vision of Islam. For many, it was suffocating. For others, salvation, Al-Andalus had been a mosaic. Now it was a fortress. And in the north, the Christian kingdoms, stunned by their defeat, pulled back. The Reconquista slowed, but it did not stop, because history had already shifted. The fall of Toledo had sent shockwaves through Europe. It had reminded Christendom that Iberia was not just a frontier, it was a battlefield for the soul of the continent. Pilgrims began traveling westward not just to Rome or Jerusalem, but to Santiago de Compostela, where the bones of St. James, Santiago Matamoros, the Moor Slayer, were said to rest. A cult was born. And with it, a new kind of war, one of saints and swords, of miracles and martyrdom. Christian kings began to frame their battles not merely as political conquests, but as holy crusades. The Reconquista became more than ambition. It became mission. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. The fire lit in the east also spread to the west. French knights crossed into Iberia, joining local armies, forging alliances with Castilian kings. They fought not just for gold or land, but for absolution, for heaven. And they brought with them a new code: chivalry, devotion, and fanaticism. But war, like the mountains, has many faces. Even as Christian and Muslim empires clashed, within their borders, cultures still bled into one another. Muslim artisans built churches, Christian scribes copied Arabic texts. Jewish philosophers debated theology in the courts of both sides. The violence of conquest could not erase the truth. Iberia remained entangled. Still, the blade did not rest. In the early 12th century, the Almoravid grip began to falter. Their austerity bred resentment. Their control, rigid and distant, began to crack. And from the same desert that had birthed them, another flame began to rise. The Almohads, even more extreme, even more determined. They believed the Almoravids had grown soft, corrupted by the wealth of Iberia, seduced by the very decadence they had once vowed to destroy. So they rose up in North Africa, swept through Morocco like wildfire, and crossed into Al-Andalus. What they found was an empire exhausted. The Almohads took Seville in 1147, establishing their own dynasty. They too ruled with iron and zeal, purging what they saw as blasphemy, enforcing a stricter orthodoxy, and launching fresh campaigns against the Christian kingdoms. But while the Muslim south changed hands, the Christian north grew stronger. In the west, the small but fierce county of Portugal broke from Leon and declared itself a kingdom. In 1139, Afonso Henriques crowned himself King of Portugal, and the Vatican recognized his sovereignty soon after. Another Christian power was born, young, hungry, and ready to carve its own path down the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, the crown of Aragon expanded eastward and south, drawing strength from trade, naval power, and strategic marriages. And in Castile and Leon, rulers began to see not just the possibility of survival, but domination. The balance of power was shifting again, but perhaps the most decisive moment came in 1212. In the rocky heart of central Spain, near a place called Las Navas de Tolosa, a coalition of Christian armies, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and knights from across Europe, gathered to face the full might of the Almohad Caliphate. It was not just a battle, it was an exorcism. The Christian forces, outnumbered and facing fortified positions, charged the enemy in a brutal, bloody assault. The turning point came when a Castilian force broke through the chain-linked human shields protecting the caliph's tent, shattering the Muslim command. Panic spread. The Almohads were routed. Las Navas de Tolosa shattered the myth of Muslim invincibility in Iberia. The path south was open, and the kingdoms of the north were no longer fighting to survive. They were hunting. What began in the caves of Asturias was now a full march toward the heart of Al-Andalus. Córdoba, Valencia, and Seville would fall within a generation. The old caliphate, once a beacon of light, began to flicker and fade. Only one city remained, Granada, a last glittering fragment of the Muslim dream. But even it knew the end was coming, for the fires of conquest now burned in royal hearts, and in one fateful union, of crown, of cross, of love and ambition, a new monarchy would rise. A monarchy that would end the war, that would claim not just Spain, but the world. That is what comes next, but the road to Granada still runs red. The last light of Al-Andalus shimmered like a dying star, Granada. Nestled at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, it was a city of contradiction, clinging to splendor while bracing for collapse. Its palaces were carved from dreams, its streets alive with poetry and perfume, yet its walls bore the weight of centuries. Every brick whispered of battles survived, of sultans crowned and betrayed, of a world shrinking hour by hour. By the late 13th century, the Reconquista had become an unstoppable tide. Seville had fallen, Valencia too. Córdoba, once the jewel of the Islamic world, now echoed with the toll of Christian bells. The great caliphates were dust, the taifas long swallowed. What remained of Muslim Iberia was little more than a flickering ember, a single kingdom holding out against the inevitable. The Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. Founded in 1230 by Muhammad ibn al-Ahmar, the Nasrids were survivors, masters of diplomacy, tribute, and strategic submission. They built their kingdom not on conquest, but on calculation. For over 2.5 centuries, they played the Christian monarchs against one another, paying gold to avoid the sword. It was not pride, it was survival, and above it all stood the Alhambra. Have you seen it? Not in postcards or paintings, but truly seen it? The Red Fortress. The palace of water and light arches that defy gravity, ceilings that shimmer like constellations, rooms where silence feels holy. Built on a ridge overlooking the city, the Alhambra is not a building, it is a final breath, a love letter to a civilization already mourning itself. But Granada's beauty could not stop the world from turning, because while the Nasrids played their delicate game in the south, the north was no longer fractured. It had fused into something formidable: Castile, Leon, Aragon. And in 1469, something extraordinary happened. A marriage. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, 2 crowns, 1 vision. Their union was more than romantic, it was revolutionary. For the first time, Christian Spain stood under a single united front. The Trastamara dynasty was now the beating heart of a new kingdom, and its pulse was war. Ferdinand was shrewd, militarily disciplined, and politically astute. Isabella, intelligent, devout, and relentless. Together, they embodied the future of Spain, centralized, Catholic, and hungry. They wasted no time in asserting their authority. Nobles were brought to heel, cities were fortified, a bureaucracy formed, and looming ever in their path was Granada. The final campaign began in 1482. 10 years of sieges, raids, treaties broken and made again. The Christian forces moved like a tide, slow, suffocating, inevitable. Town after town fell. The Nasrid court, once so skilled at navigating Christian politics, began to fracture. Factions emerged. Betrayals mounted. And at the center of this chaos was a boy king, Abu Abdallah Muhammad XV. The Spaniards called him Boabdil. Thrust onto the throne amid civil war and intrigue, Boabdil was young, ambitious, and doomed. He sought negotiation when his people demanded resistance. He surrendered territory in the hopes of sparing blood. And when his rivals seized the city in his absence, he allied with the Christians to reclaim it, only to find himself a puppet, a king in name only. His fate was not his own. It never had been. By 1491, Granada was surrounded. Boabdil's forces were outnumbered, his coffers empty, his people starved. Inside the Alhambra, he watched as the hills around his city bloomed with the enemy's tents. The siege was silent, methodical. No glory, no chivalry, just the tightening grip of inevitability. And on January 2, 1492, it ended. Boabdil surrendered the keys to the city. He rode out to meet Ferdinand and Isabella beneath the white banners of truce. No throne, no crown, just a defeated man, offering the last breath of Muslim Spain to the monarchs who would forge a new world. As he departed, he stopped at a mountain pass, turned, and looked back at Granada one last time. The pass is still there. They call it El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's sigh. They say his mother, Aixa, scorned him. You weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man. But what else could he have done? Granada was never truly his to save. And so, 8 centuries after Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait and lit the spark of Al-Andalus, the final ember faded. But the fall of Granada was not just the end of Muslim Spain. It was the beginning of something far more powerful, far more dangerous. In that same year, 1492, the ink dried on another decree. The Alhambra Decree. Ferdinand and Isabella ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. Convert or leave. Centuries of coexistence, tenuous, imperfect, erased with a single signature. Synagogues were emptied, homes abandoned, whole communities vanished overnight. This was no longer a diverse Iberia. This was Catholic Spain, unified, purged, reborn, and the new monarchs, now hailed as Los Reyes Católicos, turned their gaze outward. Their sword had conquered a kingdom. Now it would conquer the world. In April of that same year, a Genoese sailor stood before them. Weathered, obsessive, a man with maps and promises and a hunger for the horizon. Christopher Columbus. They gave him 3 ships and a royal blessing, and by October the ocean had ceased to be a boundary. Spain had crossed it. What began in the caves of Covadonga, with a few rebels fleeing into the mist, had become something no one could have imagined. An empire, not of cities, but of continents. But in the echoes of celebration, something darker stirred. A legacy soaked in blood, betrayal, and fire. A crown forged in conflict, and a church that would burn its enemies in the name of purity. The Reconquista was over, but the Inquisition was only just beginning. Smoke doesn't rise from the stake. It lingers. It curls around the air like a question with no answer. Acrid, solemn, sacred. In plazas where markets once bustled and churches whispered of mercy, fires now burned for a different God, one cloaked not in divinity, but in power. Because in the newly unified kingdom of Spain, faith was no longer just belief. It was law, and where there is law, there is punishment. In the wake of Granada's fall, as banners of Castile and Aragon flew high over towers that once echoed with the call to prayer, the Catholic monarchs turned inward. The Moors had been driven to the sea, the Jews exiled or forced into shadows. But that wasn't enough. What about those who remained? What about those who converted to survive? The conversos, Jews and Muslims who had publicly embraced Christianity, now found themselves trapped between identities. To the state, they were suspicious. To their former communities, they were traitors. And to the church, they were heretics in disguise. So the crown gave the church teeth. In 1478, even before Granada's final surrender, Ferdinand and Isabella petitioned the Pope for a terrifying new institution, the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Its mission? To root out false converts, to purify Spain's soul. But behind the religious rhetoric lay something far colder: control. The Inquisition operated like a shadow government. It answered not to bishops, but to the crown. It had its own courts, its own prisons, its own language of fear. Accusation was enough. Trials were secret. Confessions extracted by means no man could withstand. Property was seized, names erased, terror became policy. In cathedrals across Spain, grand processions known as autos de fe, acts of faith, were held. They were theater and execution rolled into one. Thousands gathered in silent awe as the condemned, draped in yellow tunics marked with flames and devils, were paraded through the streets. Some were flogged, some imprisoned. Others burned alive. And the people watched. Some wept. Others cheered. Have you ever asked yourself how far a nation will go to remain pure? The Inquisition asked that question daily, and the answers it found carved Spain's soul in ways war never could. But even as flames consumed the heretic, the crown's ambitions burned hotter. For Spain no longer saw itself as a single kingdom. It saw itself as destiny incarnate. With Granada subdued, the Jews expelled, and the church secured, Ferdinand and Isabella now wielded a terrifying kind of power, absolute, righteous, unchallenged. And then, the oceans opened. Columbus's voyage in 1492 did not find Asia. It found something far more profitable, a new world. Within a generation, Spain's flag flew over the Caribbean, then Mexico, then Peru. Gold poured into Seville like a tide. Ships heavy with silver crossed the Atlantic beneath Catholic sails. Conquistadors, fueled by greed and divine mission, tore through empires older than their own. Aztecs, Incas, countless others, shattering civilizations with steel, fire, and disease. And behind every expedition was the crown. The Spanish monarchy, once a patchwork of warring states, now commanded an empire where the sun never set. Its power was unmatched, its reach infinite. The wealth of half a world flowed into its veins. But power is a hungry thing, and empires built on conquest do not rest. They consume. Ferdinand and Isabella died as legends, entombed beneath marble, robed in myth. But their successors inherited not peace, but pressure. To maintain control, to expand, to enforce. Their grandson, Charles V, would inherit not just Spain, but the Holy Roman Empire. Under him, the Spanish monarchy became global, a crucible of European and American ambition. Yet even as Charles ruled from palaces in Madrid and Vienna, the shadow of the Inquisition deepened. Its gaze turned outward, toward Protestants, toward mystics, toward anyone whose soul bore the smallest stain of doubt. No one was safe, not even saints. Mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, whose visions reshaped Catholic theology, were themselves watched, questioned, threatened. Because when power is absolute, truth becomes dangerous. And even as the Church spoke of salvation, Spain's prisons swelled with the condemned. But history is not a straight line. It bends, fractures, and beneath the golden glory, the Spanish Empire was rotting. The wealth pouring in from the Americas did not strengthen the economy. It warped it. Inflation soared. The crown grew addicted to silver, borrowing against future plunder. Wars in Europe drained coffers faster than galleons could fill them. Revolts erupted in the Netherlands. The armada sent to crush Protestant England was torn apart by wind and fire. The Inquisition, once the crown's iron grip, began to lose its terror, not because it grew kinder, but because the world moved on. And in the shadows, something old stirred once more. Regional identity, local power. The same ghosts that had haunted Spain before its unification began to rise again. Catalans, Basques, Castilians, each with their own language, their own pride. Beneath the monarchy's unified crown, cracks were forming. But the rulers could not, or would not, see it. They looked to the Americas, to the East Indies, to eternity. The Spanish monarchy had become an empire of illusions, an empire chasing permanence, but what it had truly built was a stage. And on that stage, the next act would not be played with swords. It would be played with ideas, because no fire, not even the Inquisition's, can burn forever. And soon the Enlightenment would knock on the door, asking not who ruled Spain, but why. There's a silence that follows tyranny, not the peace of resolution, but the hush before a storm. The kind of quiet where something old is dying, and something dangerous is waking. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire was no longer a rising star. It was a decaying giant. Its glory had grown heavy, its riches poisoned. The American silver that once dazzled Europe now rotted its economy from within. Wars bled the treasury dry, revolts flared like sparks in the north. And behind palace walls, a single question haunted every corridor. Who would rule next? In 1700, King Charles II of Spain died. He left no heir, no sons, no daughters. Just a weak, cursed legacy, his jaw twisted, his mind clouded, his body wrecked by centuries of royal inbreeding. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, a man born under a spell. And perhaps he was. Perhaps Spain itself had been cursed by its own thirst for purity, for control, for power without consequence. When Charles II died, he took the Habsburg line with him, and the throne of Spain, the entire Spanish Empire, suddenly lay open. Two great powers stepped forward to claim it, France and Austria. Both had blood ties to the Spanish crown. Both had ambition enough to consume Europe, and neither would back down. What followed was not just a crisis. It was a war for the soul of Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession exploded across the continent. From the plains of Italy to the forests of Flanders, from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees, kings bled, generals burned, and peasants starved, all because of a crown that now symbolized more than power. It symbolized the future. Would Spain remain tethered to the decaying Habsburg vision of old-world Catholic dominance? Or would it become something new under the rising sun of Bourbon France? After 13 years of carnage, the answer came. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713. Spain would keep its empire, but it would lose its place at the center of Europe. The throne passed to a Bourbon, Philip V, grandson of France's Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, but under strict conditions. Spain and France could never unite. The vast Habsburg web was severed, and from its ashes, modern Europe began to form. Philip V did not inherit the Spain of the Catholic monarchs. He inherited a broken thing. But where others might have clung to past glories, Philip did something remarkable. He adapted. He centralized authority, streamlined bureaucracy, and brought the machinery of the French absolutist state to Madrid. Roads were built, armies reorganized. The monarchy, long bloated by tradition, was sharpened into a blade. But blades cut both ways. The Enlightenment had arrived, not with fanfare but with quiet questions that sliced through old certainties. What gives a king the right to rule? What is the role of the state? What if the people are sovereign? In France, salons burned with philosophy. In England, revolutions had already shifted the balance of power. But in Spain, a land still shadowed by the Inquisition, still haunted by empire, these ideas spread slowly, secretly, carried by exiled thinkers, smuggled texts, and whispers among the educated. And then came Carlos III, Charles III, the reformer king. He was not charismatic, not beloved, but he was precise, a child of the Enlightenment in a country still ruled by superstition. He slashed through religious excess, expelled the Jesuits, modernized cities, and tried, desperately, to drag Spain into reason. Madrid changed under him. Streetlights lit the night. Hospitals, schools, and royal academies sprang up. Spanish science, long shackled by orthodoxy, began to breathe again. But progress comes at a price. The church recoiled. The aristocracy whispered. And the people, those still clinging to the myths of saints and empire, grew restless. Enlightenment Spain was not like France or England. It was older, heavier, bound by ghosts. And while Charles III tried to reshape it, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Because across the Atlantic, the colonies were watching. The American Revolution had ignited something dangerous. The idea that kings were not divine, that rule was a contract, not a birthright. Spain, with its sprawling empire in the New World, watched with both fear and fascination. Then came France. The Bastille fell, heads rolled, and the world changed. The French Revolution terrified the monarchies of Europe. It wasn't just the execution of a king, it was the execution of monarchy itself. In Spain, the Bourbons looked on in horror as their cousins were dragged through the streets of Paris. And then the man came, Napoleon Bonaparte. He promised order. He brought war. By 1808, his armies stood at Spain's doorstep. King Charles IV, weak and indecisive, was forced to abdicate. His son, Ferdinand VII, was imprisoned. Napoleon placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain. A Frenchman ruling Madrid. It was the deepest insult imaginable. But what followed was something Napoleon didn't expect. Spain rose, not as a united army, but as a people. Guerrilla warfare, peasant uprisings, priests with muskets, farmers with knives. Entire villages burned rather than submit. It was savage, desperate, and without mercy. French troops called it the Spanish ulcer. The war bled their empire dry, and in this chaos, something strange happened. The Spanish people began to imagine a different kind of nation, one not built on kings and conquests, but on constitution. In 1812, in the city of Cadiz, while the French still occupied the capital, Spanish representatives gathered to draft a new vision. La Pepa, the Constitution of 1812, one of the most liberal in Europe. It declared sovereignty belonged to the people. It limited the power of the king. It guaranteed rights. It was a spark in the darkness. But sparks are fragile. When Napoleon fell, Ferdinand VII returned, and with him, the old order. He abolished the Constitution, jailed its authors, and Spain lurched backward. The Enlightenment had arrived, and then it was smothered. But ideas don't die. They linger like smoke after fire. And in the far reaches of the Spanish Empire, in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Argentina, those same ideas had already taken root. Spain would not only lose its colonies, it would lose the illusion of control, and the monarchy that had once ruled the oceans would be left to ask, what is a king in a world that no longer believes in crowns? A king without a kingdom is just a man. And by the mid-19th century, Spain's monarchs had become little more than shadows wearing crowns. The empire was gone, bled out across jungles, mountains, and coastlines on foreign shores. Mexico had declared independence. So had Colombia. Peru, Chile, Argentina. One by one, the colonies had broken free, not through sudden violence, but through a slow, deliberate unspooling of belief. The myth of imperial Spain had unraveled, and back home, the center could no longer hold. The return of Ferdinand VII in 1814 had been hailed as a restoration of divine order. He tore up the Constitution of Cadiz, reimposed absolutism, reopened the dungeons. But he returned not to a grateful nation, but to a boiling one. His people were starving. His treasury was empty. And beneath his feet, the floorboards of monarchy groaned with rot. Yet still, he clung to the past, the idea that a king's will was God's law. But Spain had changed. The Enlightenment had already crept into the classrooms, into the salons, into the blood of the next generation. Liberals, intellectuals, and soldiers alike wanted a modern nation, one ruled by law, not lineage. What followed was not just instability. It was a fracture in the soul of Spain itself, a fracture that would bleed for the next century. When Ferdinand died in 1833, he left behind not a warrior son, but a 3-year-old daughter, Isabella. Her ascension shattered the realm. The old guard, the Carlistas, rose up in rebellion, rallying behind Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, who claimed the crown by male inheritance. But this was not just a dynastic squabble. This was civil war. The Carlists represented the conservative Spain, monarchist, Catholic, rural, reactionary. They believed in the divine right of kings. They saw Isabella as illegitimate, and they would die to restore their world. What followed was the First Carlist War. It tore across the countryside like a fever. Villages turned against each other. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Priests led militias. Executions became ritual. Neither side had mercy. And though Isabella's regents eventually held the throne, the scars were deep. The monarchy had not been strengthened by war. It had been hollowed out. Isabella II took the crown as a child. She ruled in a world not of her making, dominated by court intrigue, military coups, and shifting alliances. Her reign was a storm of instability. Liberal and conservative factions tore the government apart. Generals made and unmade her ministers. The church lurked in every shadow, and the queen herself. She became the symbol of everything broken. Rumors swirled, affairs, incompetence, vanity. She was mocked in the streets, hated by both Republicans and purists. To some, she was too liberal, to others, too conservative. But to all, she was not enough. By 1868, the people had had enough. They called it La Gloriosa, the Glorious Revolution. But it was no celebration. Troops mutinied, cities rose, and Isabella fled into exile. For the first time in centuries, Spain was without a monarch. And something strange happened. It survived. A short-lived constitutional monarchy was established under a foreign king, Amadeo of Savoy. He lasted barely 2 years before resigning, calling the Spanish people ungovernable. In 1873, the unthinkable became real. The First Spanish Republic. No kings, no queens, just citizens, law, and the impossible weight of freedom. But the dream was brief. Factionalism tore the Republic apart almost immediately. Monarchists, federalists, anarchists, and Carlists plunged the country into chaos. Coups, revolts, assassinations. Spain had tried to become a modern republic, but it had not yet become a modern nation. And so, in 1874, the pendulum swung back. The Bourbon monarchy was restored under Alfonso V, Isabella's son. He promised order, promised unity, and for a time, he delivered it. Spain entered a period of relative calm. The Inquisition was gone. The economy grew. A new constitution was drafted. But beneath the surface, the old sickness remained. Spain was no longer a great power. Its colonies were dwindling. Its pride had become performance. And in 1898, the final curtain fell, the Spanish-American War. It lasted mere months, but it destroyed what remained of the empire. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, all gone. It was called El Desastre, the disaster, but it was more than military defeat. It was an identity collapse. The crown no longer represented empire, it represented loss. And in the cafes and universities, a new generation began to ask dangerous questions. What does Spain mean without its empire? What is left when the story is over? The generation of '98, writers, poets, intellectuals, turned their pens to these wounds. They saw a nation adrift, a monarchy detached, and a people still ruled by nostalgia. While other European powers surged forward into the 20th century, Spain stood still, watching its reflection fade, and yet the monarchy endured. It survived not through love, but inertia. Alfonso III, born posthumously after Alfonso X's death, took the throne as a child. By the early 20th century, he ruled in name, but power had begun to shift. Parliament squabbled. Dictators flirted with control. Laborers protested. Anarchists bombed. Spain was not one country. It was many, bound by monarchy, but not united in soul. Then came World War I. Spain remained neutral, profited, but did not grow stronger. Corruption worsened, inequality deepened, and as Europe tore itself apart, Spain merely drifted, until drifting became falling. In 1923, a military coup brought General Miguel Primo de Rivera to power. Alfonso XIII supported it, hoping to restore order through strongman rule, but instead he tied the crown to a dictatorship, and when Rivera fell in 1930, the monarchy fell with him. Elections were held. Republicans swept the cities. Crowds chanted in the plazas, and Alfonso III, unwilling to cause civil war, chose exile. The Second Republic was born, and for the second time in history, Spain said goodbye to its kings. But this time, it did not whisper. It shouted. Churches were burned, land was seized, women voted, schools opened. Spain was becoming modern, and the old order, stripped of power, watched in horror. And in that clash between old Spain and new, final reckoning loomed, one last war, not for empire, not for colonies, but for Spain itself, a war that would pit brother against brother and crown against grave. Spain broke in two, not along its borders, but along its heart. In 1936, after decades of tension, betrayal, and impossible dreams, the fragile framework of the Second Republic collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. What began as a political crisis became a firestorm of ideology, identity, and vengeance. The Republic, progressive, secular, fractured, stood for modernity. But against it rose something older, darker, more ruthless. The military, led by a man no one expected to become a tyrant, Francisco Franco. He was quiet, conservative, unremarkable to many. But what he lacked in charisma, he made up for in calculation. And when right-wing officers rose against the Republic, it was Franco who crossed from the Spanish colonies in Morocco, carving a path of blood through the peninsula. It wasn't just a coup. It was the beginning of a civil war. Spain tore itself apart. Families split. Churches became battlegrounds. Entire towns vanished. On one side, the Republicans, a chaotic alliance of liberals, socialists, anarchists, and communists. On the other, the nationalists, monarchists, fascists, clergy, and military men seeking to restore order through force. But this was not a war Spain fought alone. It became the testing ground for something even more monstrous. Germany sent bombers. Italy sent troops. Hitler and Mussolini used Spain as a laboratory for future conquest. And the world watched as the skies above places like Guernica turned black with fire. Guernica, a town erased in minutes. Civilians, children, animals, all torn to shreds by German planes in service of Franco's cause. Pablo Picasso immortalized the horror in a painting that still screams in silence. But at the time, the world merely wrung its hands. The Republic cried out for help, and help came from the people. Volunteers from across the globe flooded into Spain. Poets, students, laborers, Americans, Brits, Poles, Irish, Germans. They joined the international brigades, idealists willing to die for a Spain they'd never known. Some called it romantic, others called it suicide. But for 3 long years they fought and lost. In 1939, Franco stood victorious. The Republic was dead, its leaders imprisoned or executed, its cities silenced, its hope extinguished. Spain had a ruler again, but not a king, a general. Franco declared himself caudillo, a title echoing the strong men of Rome. He wore the cross of Catholic Spain and draped his regime in the robes of nationalism. Monarchists hoped he'd restore the crown. Fascists believed he'd forge a new empire. But Franco had other plans. He froze Spain. The monarchy, now reduced to a memory, became a tool in his arsenal. He did not abolish it. He suspended it, like a relic on a dusty shelf. And he kept its heir, young Juan de Bourbon, at arm's length, promising, withholding, controlling. Because Franco wasn't interested in kings, he was interested in legacy. He turned Spain inward. A prison of fear, censorship and ritual, public executions, secret police, propaganda. The church was restored to glory, confession and control hand in hand. Catalan and Basque languages were outlawed. Memory itself was rewritten, but the world moved on. World War II came and went. Franco, though aligned with fascist ideology, had remained officially neutral. And so, while Hitler's corpse burned in a Berlin bunker, Franco endured. The Allies, now obsessed with containing communism, looked the other way. Spain remained isolated, backward, frozen in black and white while the rest of Europe exploded into color. Franco aged, and with age came inevitability. He could not rule forever, and so, in a move that stunned the monarchy's few remaining loyalists, he reached for the crown once more, but not for Don Juan, the rightful Bourbon heir in exile. Franco chose the heir's son, Juan Carlos, a boy he could mold, raise, shape, a monarch not of blood and tradition, but of loyalty, a king made by dictatorship. Juan Carlos was brought to Spain, trained in military academies, paraded at official ceremonies. And when Franco died in 1975, after nearly 4 decades of absolute rule, the crown passed not in rebellion or revolution, but in silence. Spain became a monarchy again. But no one knew what kind. Would Juan Carlos continue Franco's legacy? Would he reign as a puppet, or would he do the unthinkable? He did the unthinkable. In a series of bold, quiet moves, Juan Carlos dismantled the dictatorship from within. He legalized political parties, supported democratic reform, embraced a new constitution. In 1978, Spain became a parliamentary monarchy, not ruled by the king, but safeguarded by him. And then, in 1981, came the test, a coup. Tanks in the streets, armed men storming parliament, guns drawn, the past clawing its way back. The nation froze, and then Juan Carlos appeared, on national television, in full military dress, not to support the coup, but to condemn it. He ordered the army back to their barracks. He chose democracy. The fall didn't come with a revolution, no torches, no barricades, no gallows in the square. It came with whispers, headlines, bank statements, offshore accounts. By the early 21st century, the Spanish monarchy no longer stood on a pedestal of divine right or imperial grandeur. It stood on the shoulders of public trust, a fragile, modern illusion. And like all illusions, it shattered the moment it was touched by light. Juan Carlos I had been the king who restored democracy, the king who stared down a coup, the king who symbolized a new Spain, open, liberal, forward-looking. For decades, he was untouchable, celebrated, even loved, but power, it never forgets how to corrupt. And beneath the surface of the smiling monarch, something darker had taken root. In 2011, the first cracks appeared. A scandal broke. It wasn't about the king himself, but about his son-in-law, Iñaki Urdangarin. A former Olympic handball player turned businessman, Urdangarin had been caught embezzling millions in public funds through a fraudulent nonprofit. His wife, the king's daughter Christina, was implicated. And suddenly, the royal house, once seen as above politics, was dragged into the mire of corruption. The Spanish people, already reeling from a brutal economic crisis, were furious. Unemployment was soaring. Austerity measures were strangling the middle class. Evictions swept through cities like a plague. And while ordinary citizens lost their homes, the palace grew quieter, colder. Then, in 2012, a photograph emerged, Juan Carlos, dressed in hunting gear, smiling beside the carcass of a rare African elephant. He had been on a secret luxury safari in Botswana during one of the darkest moments of Spain's financial collapse. The outrage was immediate, not just for the animal, not just for the cost, but for what it revealed. A monarch out of touch, drunk on privilege, insulated from the suffering of his people. For the first time in modern history, the Spanish public turned on the king. Poll numbers plummeted, protest flared, old wounds reopened about monarchy, class, accountability. The press dug deeper. More secrets emerged, affairs, money, and something worse, the quiet rumor of offshore accounts, shadow transactions, influence peddling. The king apologized on television. "I am very sorry. I made a mistake. It will not happen again." But it wasn't enough. Spain had changed. It was no longer the wounded nation he had helped heal. It was younger now, angrier, more democratic, less afraid. The myth of the benevolent king no longer held. And in 2014, Juan Carlos abdicated. His son, Felipe VI, took the throne. A clean break, a new face. Felipe was modern, tall, serious, fluent in the language of transparency and reform. He swore to rebuild trust, to slim the royal household, to distance himself from scandal. He stripped his sister Christina of her title, severed ties with Urdangarin, focused on constitutional duties, and for a moment it worked. But the ghosts were not done. In 2020, as the pandemic swept across the world and Spain mourned thousands of its dead, new revelations emerged. Swiss bank accounts, a $100 million payment from Saudi Arabia, a tangled web of financial secrecy that led back, not to Felipe, but to his father, Juan Carlos, the hero king. The man who once saved democracy was now being investigated for financial crimes. Felipe moved quickly, renounced any personal inheritance from his father, stripped him of his annual stipend, issued a rare public statement. But it wasn't just about legality. It was about faith. Faith in the monarchy, in its purpose, in its right to exist. In August 2020, Juan Carlos fled the country, quietly, exiled not by decree, but by disgrace. He slipped into the desert heat of Abu Dhabi, far from the streets of Madrid where his portrait still hung, silent, smiling, tarnished. And the crown? It endured, but barely. Republican sentiment surged. Polls revealed a generational divide. The young wanted change. The old held on to memory. Parliament tiptoed. Political parties clashed. Debates raged. Not just about Juan Carlos, but about the monarchy itself. What does it do? Whom does it serve? And why should it survive? Felipe VI, now king in a country where faith in royalty has cracked, walks a tightrope of tradition and reform. He reigns not by divine grace nor ancestral conquest, but by consent. And consent in this century is not permanent. It must be earned, again and again. So where does that leave Spain, a country with no empire, no crusade, no crown worn with absolute power, just a memory, a symbol, a man in a palace, and a people watching, remembering the centuries of glory and blood, tyranny and revolution, survival and shame. Spain's monarchy has seen it all: Visigoths and caliphates, conquests and inquisitions, cathedrals and colonies, civil war and dictatorship, renaissance and ruin. It is not just the story of kings and queens. It is the story of a nation forever rewriting itself, through crowns, through fires, and through the quiet question whispered from generation to generation: do we still need them, or are we finally ready to stand alone?